There's a common saying in computer science: garbage in, garbage out. And that refers to the fact that if you're putting flawed inputs into any equation or any software program, then you can't expect good output based on flawed data. And this translates perfectly to what we see going on in the economy right now and the Federal Reserve and its decision making. There's a growing chorus of people in FinTwit who believe that the Federal Reserve is making a mistake right now with their over tightening in the economy. And part of the reason why they're doing that could be because they are putting garbage inputs into their decision-making process. This is part one of my interview with the Happy Hawaiian, where we talk about three main parameters that the Fed is looking at right now that are based on flawed data that could be contributing to this policy error that the Fed is making. And in part one, we're talking about the largest contributor to CPI, the rent. Without any further ado, here is the Happy Hawaiian. What's up, guys? I'm nobody special, and I am very happy today. I have the Happy Hawaiian is with us today. Happy Hawaiian is one of those few individuals who is actually on my channel bucket list. So he is now the third one I get to scratch off. Happy, how are you doing today?
Doing well. I'm home for the holidays, just enjoying my time. And I'm flattered to be on your bucket list of people to have on your channel. I had no idea.
It is a very short list. I've already had Joe Brown from Heresy Financial. I've had the Last Bear Standing from FinTwit on, and now I've got the Happy Hawaiian. There are two more out there that are on my bucket list that have not been on my channel. You're welcome to guess, folks. Let me know down in the comments below who you think the last two are. But the reason I brought you on, Happy, is I've been noticing some problems recently centering around the Fed and the inflation data, and more recently the jobs and the energy data. And you've had a couple of tweets recently that were kind of right along those lines that I think when you put all this stuff together in aggregate, it paints a little bit of a scary picture. So I wanted to bring you on to talk about that. So I am going to share the screen here and show you the first one. You tweeted this out a couple of days ago. You said, good news, real world rents are declining. Bad news, CPI is still vastly understating their growth. In your opinion, CPI will never catch up, will never reflect the true rate of shelter inflation. Then pause before you comment about lags. Look at the next tweet. So we'll get to the next tweet. But I want to bring up this chart here that you showed. And what are we looking at here on this chart?
Yeah, so I've been tweeting this out probably every month for about a year now. Just comparing both the rent of primary residence and owner's equivalent rent measures in the CPI, which comprise the shelter component. It's 1/3 of the entire index right here. In shelter, and I'm comparing that to the Zillow Observed Rent Index. So there's multiple criticisms I get when I make this comparison. One is that Zillow is asking rents and CPI is realized rents. It's the rent people are actually paying, and that moves slower than Zillow, so you should expect a lag. I have two comebacks to that one. One, the Zillow Rent Index is an 80-20 mix, 80% observed realized rents and 20% asking rents. So they're using a more consistent methodology than people think. Two, they have a way larger sample than the BLS because they're surveying millions of residences, whereas the BLS surveys tens of thousands of units. And then three, the time lag component is true. So whether it should be there or not, the CPI definitely lags the real world, I guess, due to the leasing cycle, and maybe a few other reasons that people have brought up that I don't buy as much. But if you go to the next one, or I guess, hold on, pause 1 second, just to look at this one. This is the rent of primary residence.
That's in blue.
And we're roughly, since 2018, I believe is when I started this one. Yep, 2018. For the CPI to catch up to what the rents people are actually having to pay today, we would need to reflect essentially a 15% jump overnight in the shelter component, which would boost CPI by 5 points. So instead of 7% inflation, we'd be at 12%, just for it to catch up to reality, essentially. But I don't think it's ever going to catch up because the gap is too large. And it looks like even the CPI rents are going to start rolling over in maybe February to April. One of those months should be the peak. And for it to catch up, it would need to continue increasing rather than top out in a few months. So if you
So
go to the next, yeah, go ahead.
a couple of things I noticed on this chart. First of all, the rent started to skyrocket, as most people who rent would tell you, early 2021. I mean, this line went
Yep.
vertical. This the orange line, and the CPI just didn't move. And this has been one of my big criticisms of CPI since I started my channel is owner's equivalent rent, and the way rent is measured in the inflation data understates it. But now it's starting to catch up. You see the actual CPI reading is starting to steepen to the upside now. Even though for the last 3 months, you'll notice in the orange line, it's finally starting to roll over and to come down. But that's not going to be accurately reflected in the CPI because the CPI is still heading upward faster, even though now the rent is actually starting to come down. So the
Yep.
CPI data is not telling us what the real world is telling us. And so the Fed is using this as a gauge to make decisions about the state of the economy and monetary policy. But the indicators that they're using are telling the wrong story. And you can see that here. The rents should have gone higher last year, and now they're coming down. But if you look at what CPI is telling us, the rents are still going up.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you follow any more mainstream FinTwit people who work for, say, Bloomberg or Wall Street Journal, their hair is on fire right now, and they're screaming that the inflation in the real world's actually lower, and the Fed is should already be more dovish, which I actually agree with, but for different reasons. Um, because in the real world, rents are coming down, and CPI they're still increasing. So what the hell is happening? But for the last 18 months, they were not complaining when it was going the other way. Um,
Right.
and real world rents were increasing much faster, and the CPI wasn't reflecting it. Their complaints seemed to only go one direction.
Yeah, I mean, now we're paying the price for the data being artificially skewed lower in prior months. Now that real world inflation is responding the way the Fed wants it to respond, the data doesn't show it for the same reason that it was understated. So,
Right.
the
And
theme we're going to
this
see
is
over and over here, folks, garbage in, garbage out is what I'm borrowing from some software engineers. When the inputs to your math are bad, flawed data points, then you cannot possibly get good outputs from your decision making, from your calculations, because the output is only as good as what you put in, and there's bad data going in.
right. And when I've tweeted this out prior, I've tried to list out reasons why this matters so much. The CPI is considered the main cost of living index, which I would criticize that characterization heavily. But it's used to adjust Social Security payments, tax brackets, a bevy of government programs to help the poor. So if it's not properly reflecting the actual cost increases people are facing, then those people are going to face hardship. So the BLS might shrug this off as just a small data error, but it's causing immense suffering by the people who need the money the most by not actually reflecting this properly.
That is a great point. If you are, say bottom 10% income earners and you're reliant on government programs right now, the gap between these two lines, that is your misery increasing
Exactly.
because your assistance has not risen at a pace commensurate with what your cost of living has done, and so your life has gotten more miserable. It's gotten harder. So
Yeah.
there are real world impacts of this data. These are not just data points on a chart, folks. This affects people's lives severely. Now you
Exactly.
had another one
That's
here.
why I'm so passionate.
Yeah, absolutely. And the same here. The understating of inflation is just victimizes the working class probably more than
Absolutely.
most people realize. Now on this
But
other
it's
one here, you said it's true that CPI rents reflect a significant lag to real world rents. And that's lag. We've heard a lot about that from the Fed recently. The chart below uses a 12-month trailing average of Zillow rents to account for this. So you're smoothing out the curve with a 12-month average, and this ensured proper correlation between the CPI and the real world. But starting in 2021, a huge unnatural divergence began.
right.
And there you can see it. In blue is the Zillow rent index. Now this is the 12-month moving average, so you've smoothed out the spikes. but still it shows the CPI rent of primary and the CPI owner's equivalent rent, the metrics the BLS uses, significantly lagging versus how it's historically performed.
Right. Yeah. So here I'm breaking it out into the two separate shelter components and comparing it to the 12-month trailing average to try to reflect that lag. And as you can see, that was a great, there was a great correlation between the two until the start of 2021, when, from what I can tell, the BLS just stopped paying attention to some of these rent increases, and maybe because they were too severe, maybe they didn't want to scare people, maybe they just have terrible data. I'm not sure, but the gap is still there when accounting for the lags, because this is the most common critique I get when I post this updated chart each month is, oh, well, there's a lag, you're an idiot, just wait for it to catch up. But I've been waiting for over a year now, and this gap keeps growing, even accounting for the lag. So there's a significant issue here that continues to be unaddressed.
The lag, I remember it was back about August of 2021 when I was doing my CPI preview videos. I had mentioned the lag and that we're a few months out from the rent really jumping up. And month after month before the CPI came out, when I did the preview videos, I was saying how, hey, owner's equivalent rent should catch up next month. It should catch up next month. That was this gap growing, but the rent numbers in the CPI were not growing along with it. The gap kept getting bigger. And then eventually I stopped doing those preview videos because they were pointless, essentially, because the data was just so flawed.
Absolutely. And
now look what we're talking about here. This is a 34% jump, and even smoothing out the curve, again, 12-month average, a 34% jump in the rents on the ground, according to Zillow, even though CPI is only telling us 20 or 21%. I mean, this is the single biggest line item in a working class family's budget, is their shelter. And the CPI has failed to capture 50% of its move in the last 4 years. Yep. That is a severely flawed data point.
Yeah. And you follow me on Twitter, so I'm sure you've seen my attempt to predict monthly inflation as well. So I've just been continuously refining a model I'm doing for fun, essentially, on the side. And shelter is one piece I've gotten right just about every month, almost exactly. And it's because there is such a consistent rate at which CPI is failing to reflect the real world. So I'll put in the real world rent data, and there's essentially another trend you can calculate that ends up being pretty linear of how fast the divergence between the two is growing. And as I predict it, I'm just trying to be accurate for CPI, not trying to measure the actual inflation people are feeling. And it's just depressing to see that gap grow every single month without fail. So I'm hoping it closes, because I want people to have their Social Security checks increased who rely on it. And I want people who rely on housing assistance and food stamps and all of these other programs to get the pay that they need. So fingers crossed it fixes itself over time. I'm not sure it ever will, but here's something, I guess.
You've developed your own mathematical model to predict the growing error between what CPI is telling us and what the real world is showing us.
Yeah, and I try to do that for most of the big components in CPI. And to be fair, some of them don't have this sort of growing error.
So there you have it, folks. The way that the rent is being communicated in the CPI right now is causing two problems. Number one, CPI should have gone much higher earlier this year than it actually peaked at. The second problem is that CPI should be showing inflation coming down right now much faster than it actually is. And because of this error, the CPI is not showing the results of the Fed's tightening that should already be reflected in the data. And this is leading the Fed to overcompensate and raise too far. And that could have disastrous effects for the economy in the months to come. This was just part one of my interview with the Happy Hawaiian. You can see a link to his Twitter feed down below. I highly recommend that. And keep an eye out in the days ahead for the next chapter in this series, where we talk about another big input to inflation, energy. Till next time, live small and dream big.